Mehmet, are all interpreters here as well?
Yes, they're all here.
And what are the languages again?
It's Dutch, French, Spanish, Italian, and Turkish. So like 5 languages.
Awesome.
And French, I guess.
German?
Okay, sorry. Okay. Yeah, there are 90 people. Eva, should we start?
Yes, let's do it. What time is it? 7. It's perfect. So are we live? Yes. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Eva Seis, and I work for the Intercultural Dialogue Platform. It is a very, very big pleasure to see all of you tonight in such big numbers too, at this book launch event for the book Fethullah Gülen, Life of Hizmet by Jon Pahl, who is amidst us. I hope that you all have had an amazing sunny weekend like we've had in Belgium. And I also hope that this event can be an inspiring end to a probably somewhat monotonous lockdown day across the globe. Tonight's event is organized by 6 civil society organizations across Europe, which are united in their pursuit of boosting intercultural and interfaith dialogue, creating community and belonging, promoting diversity and inclusion, and stimulating social cohesion and the art of living together. Likewise, the organizations, the Intercultural Dialogue Platform from Belgium, Arco Forum from Spain, Plateforme de Paris from France, Istituto Tevere from Italy, Platform INS from the Netherlands, and our newest member, I hope to pronounce this well, União M Harmony from Portugal, are also united in their values inspired by Fethullah Gülen. And therefore, as you can imagine, we are very, very excited to introduce the author and his remarkable book, which is the first critical biography of Fethullah Gülen in English. It is remarkable because it sheds light on Gülen and the Hizmet movement in a time in which both are being defamed and oppressed on a wide scale in Turkey. So far, I can see how many participants. So far, I can see we have 128 participants in the session. That is fantastic news. For the people who would prefer to watch this event from another platform or potentially encounter technical difficulties with Zoom, this event is also broadcasted live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, if I'm correct, in 6 different languages. So also, if you encounter any technical problems in the email, in the email that you have received, you can see all the different links and you can join from there. Like I said, it is also possible to like Mehmet said, it's possible to select your preferred language so that you can follow maybe more comfortably. Another thing I need to mention is if you would like to ask a question, just pop it in the Q&A box that you can see, if I'm correctly, right next to the chat box. If you prefer to engage with one of the members of the panel personally, please mention this with your question in the Q&A box and just open your camera and your mic. Lastly, we are very honored to introduce Professor Johan Leman, doctor. I will have to read this because it's a fantastic long list. Doctor in philosophy and theology, PhD in social and cultural anthropology, Masters in Eastern Philology and History, and a BA in Biblical Philology. Former Director of Integration of the Integration Center Foyer, and ex-Chief of Cabinet of the Royal Commissioner for the Migrant Policy in Belgium, and moderator of this event. Last but not least, what I cannot forget, he was also the first shareholder of the Gülen Chair at the Catholic University of Leuven between 2010 and 2015. With so much knowledge and expertise in the house tonight, and with so many participants, 143, we're counting, there's not so much left to say. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to moderator, Professor Johan Leman.
Okay. Well, good evening. The best we can do now is first to give the floor to Professor Pahl to make an expose on his very interesting book. Okay? You have some half an hour, I think.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Leman, and thank you to everyone who has joined us for this evening. And I do have a prepared remarks to keep myself in a time limit, and I hope you find what I have to say interesting. But let me begin by thanking the organizers of this event, Mehmet and Eva and Ridvan. Thank you for everyone who put work into putting this together. Thank you to the translators as well. And let me begin by saying iyi akşamlar. Good evening. I'm happy to be with you, and I very much look forward to the day when we can be together face to face, inshallah. The title of my talk this evening is Beyond Capitalism and Socialism, the social enterprise model of the global Hizmet movement inspired by Fethullah Gülen. For more than a century, we have struggled as human beings to balance individual accumulation of capital with the distribution of collective goods in ways that now threaten to render the planet Earth uninhabitable. Historically, the ideological pendulum has oscillated widely across cultures, from the unfettered and ruthless capitalist free markets of early industrialists such as Rockefeller and Carnegie, to the state-driven socialist experiments at redistribution of Lenin and Mao. Every modern society has had to decide between these two extremes, and the struggles between devotees of one economic and political ideology or another have been bloody. Now, as a historian of religions, what is interesting to me about these competing ideologies is that they both find origins in religious discourses and practices that appear to be diametrically opposed, but that upon closer examination share a common origin and structure, and what amounts to a coincidence of the opposites. Capitalism, as Max Weber cogently put it, took root first among Protestants like me. And however else we differ, and the differences are dramatic, at the core of Protestantism was and is an individual saved by grace through faith, which, as Max Weber put it, relocated the anxiety that Roman Catholicism had solved through its penitential system into efforts to demonstrate one's grace status through the display of capitalist accumulation. Modern capitalists took the spiritualized heaven of the medieval world and replaced it with the heaven of progress in earthly blessings, which manifested in industrialization, national and colonial expansion, and various civilizing efforts grounded in philanthropic charity. These commodities civilizing efforts, or these blessings, trickled down or uplifted, depending upon whether your chief economic guru was Adam Smith or John Maynard Keynes, in what we might call theological economies. Theological economies. If progress became the capitalist heaven, greed became the capitalist God. Wherever capitalism expanded, theologies and theologians, churches, denominations, were reduced in most cases to tools or handmaidens of economic and nationalist expansion. This theological economy is still very much with us, and nowhere more patently than in the present day United States. Our system of crony capitalism has inflicted or permitted colonial, if not medieval era brutalities, like a sprawling military budget, for-profit prisons filled to capacity, inhumane immigration policies, and the tragic epidemic of gun slaughter. And all of that before the abject failure and incompetence of a US federal response to COVID-19 that has led now to 500,000 deaths. And at this capitalist carnage, nary an evangelical Christian has blinked an eye, and many have been ardent, indeed, insurrectionist patriots in support. The disenchantment of the world, in Weber's brilliant phrase, continues apace under capitalist regimes, with devastating consequences for planet Earth. In response to this messianic capitalism arose the equally utopian dreams of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Vladimir Lenin, and Joseph Stalin. For them and their more recent devotees, religion is an opiate of the masses, tranquilizing workers in bourgeois pacifications, meanwhile assembling empires of military, industrial, technological weapons of mass destruction. The socialist dream of each according to one's need, to each according to one's ability, developed in an officially or practically atheist direction. What resulted, however, was an ironic outcome that mirrored capitalism in its worst manifestations. Religion was reduced to economics. To be sure, the measure of messianic communism resulted in some modest gains for workers around the world, just as capitalist free markets did lift all boats to a degree. And yet, the privileges that accrued to communist or socialist party elites repeatedly produced regimes of authoritarian repression, gulags, lying, deprivation, and exploitation of the environment, and the stockpiling of military, industrial, technological weapons of mass destruction. Enemies became mirror twins of each other in a coincidence of the opposites. Down to today, the upshot is this: under socialist as well as capitalist economies, the disenchantment of the world and the reduction of religion to a private commodity or an economic obstacle continues apace with devastating consequences for planet Earth. Now, having thus sketched out our current apocalyptic impasse, which I do not believe is an exaggeration of our dilemma, but is probably not the most winsome way to begin a lecture. I should have told some jokes or something instead, right? But I hope in my time remaining then to sketch out a third way that shows how we might get out of this tragic impasse, by restoring a proper balance between the planet, people, nation, and profits. And my chief example of this emerging third way will be a religiously based civil society movement, the global Hizmet movement inspired by Fethullah Gülen. I truly hope you can come to see how the vision of this modest Muslim preacher and scholar might just save the world. This thesis was suggested to me a few months ago now by a conversation partner at a book talk I gave at the University of Chicago. At the time, I thought that assertion was hyperbole. But as I prepared my talk for today, I have come to see it may, in fact, be an accurate reflection of the matter. So my thesis is this. The social enterprise model of the global Hizmet movement, built on the notion of mushbet harakat, positive action, inspired by Fethullah Gülen, might just help to save the world by overcoming three dualisms that have characterized the modern era. First, fact versus value, or science versus religion. Second, religion versus politics, or private versus public. And above all, third, capitalism versus socialism, or the good of the one versus the good of the many. The picture I will develop of the life of Fethullah Gülen, based on the biography of him that I wrote, and the picture of the global Hizmet movement then, is of one, an individual and movement dedicated to discovering the harmony between science and religion, or to realizing the revelation of God in both the study of nature and in the practice of our religious traditions. Secondly, again, this is still my thesis. Picture of Gülen's life and the Hizmet movement is of an individual and a movement dedicated to eroding the modern containment of religion in private experience. And yet, precisely because there is integrity in the practice of Islam, that is, its non-violent practices, respecting the democratic formation of public policies that emerge along with national sovereignty and the rule of law to distribute goods fairly. And that was a really long and complicated sentence. I apologize to the translators for that one. But third, the picture that I will develop of the life of Gülen and the Hizmet movement is of an individual and a movement of people engaged in social enterprises that manifest principled capitalism, where care for the planet comes from, quote, living simply so that others might simply live, and where being with the oppressed is the same as being with God. This kind of Hizmet, this service in the life of Gülen and in the movement he has inspired, might help us to overcome the impasse between the individualism of capitalism and the collectivism of socialism in a third way of what I call deep peace through positive action that advances literacy around the globe, that engages empathy in practical projects to alleviate suffering, and that appreciates and supports cultural and biological diversity, including those measures we must take to save the planet from our current climate crisis. Okay, so my paper is then in three parts. The first one is entitled Beyond Materialist Reductionism, Seeking Harmony Between Religion and science. At the root of the life of Fethullah Gülen and of the global Hizmet movement's model of social enterprise is a commitment to ending the warfare between religion and science. This may seem an indirect way to approach our topic, but without understanding this aspect of Gülen's life and of the Hizmet movement, one will invariably misunderstand them both. Such misunderstanding has had tragic consequences for people of Hizmet in recent years, although it is nothing new, alas, for Mr. Gülen. As I trace in the biography, young Fethullah Gülen, who was born in 1938, was cultivated in a culture dedicated to the war between science and religion. And there was little question to anyone in 1930s, 40s, or 50s Turkey where Ataturk and the military establishment stood. Young Gülen received scant education in public schools, only up to second grade. Most of his education came through his parents. His father Ramiz was an imam and scholar, and his mother Rafia was his first Quran teacher. He also studied with the noted Sufi Sheikh Muhammad Lutfi, the Imam of Alvar, among others. And yet Gülen perceived early on that an education that was only Islamic was not a full education. Or rather, he realized that the version of education he was receiving in Islam did not necessarily prepare him well for the modern world. He wrote, and I quote, "I do not fully understand the late madrasa system of studying certain things in the name of rhetorical principles and what they are good for," he said. "We were offered lots of things," he went on. "Perhaps they were useful for dialectical reasoning, but not to construct a modern line of thought. I early noticed that the madrasa did not have a modern line of rationale, a mathematical foundation, or at least a root in Baconian logic." End quote. The result was that the madrasa, and this is another long quote now from Gülen, estranged the natural sciences and research. Despite injunctions in the Quran and Sunnah, while God says we will show them our manifest signs in the horizons of the universe and within their own selves, we hardly saw research, examinations, and engagements with the nature of things. Although the Quran was read, the book of nature was left to the side. A clash emerged in the society, and the mind separated from the heart. Consequently, the book of the universe was put in one place, and the book of the Quran was put in another. End quote. And so, in an innovation with long-standing implications for the Hizmet movement, Gülen began while in Izmir in the late 1960s to hold summer camps for youth. At these camps, students studied the Quran, yes, but the natural setting also encouraged youth to study the natural world in a new light. Writing later about the relation between revelation in Quran and in the natural world, building upon the insights of the mid-20th century Kurdish reformer and theologian Said Nursi, Gülen claimed that a person must fly with two wings. Flying with two wings meant that an imbalance on either side of religion science would harm both. Quote, as stated by Bediüzzaman, Nursi, Gülen clarified, there is an understanding of education that sees the illumination of the mind in science and knowledge and the light of the heart in faith and virtue. End quote. The camps were like little laboratories in scientific living, but the students in them would also study Islam. This combination, which makes the student soar with two wings, as Gülen explained the theory, has many things to offer. It rescues science from materialism and from being a lethal weapon. And it rescues religion from being cut off from intelligence and life, and from being a fanatical institution that builds walls between individuals and nations. So, for Gülen and people of Hizmet, a faithful Muslim will be a reasonable person. Indeed, it is faithless to be irrational, just as it is irrational to be faithless. What follows from this overcoming of the fact-value dualism is the initiative, or the initiatives, among many people of Hizmet to build schools, often math and science academies, where the sciences and Islam come together to help students fly with two wings. It should hardly need to be said that our current climate crisis is both a scientific and a spiritual or ethical problem. Robust empirical science serves planetary sustainability, just as robust religion strengthens human sociability. There is no conflict between these two modes of human knowledge. In fact, we will need unprecedented energy and cooperation, unprecedented positive action across sectors to address the ecological and human refugee crises resulting from an increasingly hotter planet. Okay, that's part one. Am I doing okay? I see some thumbs up. Thank you, colleagues. I appreciate that. Part two, beyond private-public dualisms towards civil societies of private-public partnerships. If ending the warfare between science and religion is one of the roots of the social enterprise model of the global Hizmet movement inspired by Fethullah Gülen, so is ending the dualism between private and public life. Capitalist liberal democracies have tended to prioritize private rights over the public good, following the tradition of John Locke and down to today's Second Amendment gun rights advocates in the United States. In contrast, socialist societies have tended to prioritize the public welfare or good, real or imagined, over private rights, following again Marx, with long trajectories down to today's statist economies. Excuse me. But what the two systems have shared is an attempt to privatize religion, which has been met by various efforts to politicize religion, often Islamic, but increasingly Hindu in India, Christian, especially Orthodox in Russia, Jewish in Israel, Buddhist in Myanmar, and elsewhere. So one of the most intriguing and often misunderstood dimensions of the life of Fethullah Gülen and the global Hizmet movement is how, emerging out of the statist model of 1930s, 1940s Turkey, and through the liberalizing regimes of the 1970s and 80s, especially Turgut Özal, people to civil system religion. Gülen has been a public and politicized him, as has the that their commitment to sides in primary political terms then, as almost all of his critics have done, is to misunderstand or to misrepresent his life. Throughout his life, Gülen has advocated for civil Islam, or Islam from below, or I would simply say authentic Islam. The root of the word Islam, as is well known, means peace, and it is on that ground of what I call deep peace. Happy to say more about that. But on the ground of deep peace, that the Hizmet movement began as a third way, neither private nor political, but containing both. For Gülen, peace, quote, begins in the individual, resonates in the family, and from there pervades all parts of the society, end quote. A person of peace is one who prays, of course, who fasts during Ramadan, practices the other pillars of the faith. But a person of peace is also one who reaches out to others with generosity, recognizing that everything is a gift from God and everything can be done for God's pleasure. From this perspective, then, emerges the third way of hoşgörü, of tolerance, freedom, hospitality, or literally, to see nicely, seeing, this is Scott Alexander, seeing others as God sees them, that is, with eyes of mercy and compassion. Hoşgörü is the DNA of Hizmet. It builds trust within and it expands trust without. Consequently, people inspired by Fethullah Gülen began establishing media outlets, newspapers, television stations, magazines, and more that came to represent the best independent reporting in Turkey until they were closed down and the assets seized by the current Turkish regime. People inspired by Gülen, by this hoşgörü, established tutoring centers to assist high school students preparing for the rigorous one time per year college placement exam, centers which quickly came to be recognized as among the best in Turkey until they were closed down by the Turkish state. People inspired by Fethullah Gülen began a relief agency, Kimse Yok Mu, to elicit support for people who were suffering from natural disasters, who were refugees of war or famine, and which operated as an NGO following best practices in an important and crucial field of humane services. This too was shut down and the assets seized by the Turkish regime. And people inspired by Fethullah Gülen began sponsoring think tanks, dialogue centers, to bring people together across the usual divides. Business leaders and intellectuals, politicians and artists, Christians and Muslims, Jews and secularists, to discuss issues of crucial concern and to strategize paths for constructive action. The first of these think tank events was held in an iftar dinner holding 1,000 people in Istanbul at the Renaissance Polat Hotel in 1995. Fethullah Gülen was the keynoter. He did not deliver a party platform. He did not offer a revolutionary call to political Islam. He spoke instead of hoşgörü. We have seen with our own eyes, Gülen began that evening, that there's no reason to fear one another and that all people can meet with whomever they want. The event was organized by the Journalist and Writers Foundation, a private organization to serve a public purpose, to practice hoşgörü. The foundation, Gülen explained, is known in Turkey mainly as a representative of tolerance, terrible translation for hoşgörü. In fact, it has identified itself with tolerance. Whenever it is mentioned, immediately after that, tolerance is mentioned as well. But Gülen also clarified that hoşgörü was not merely a secular virtue. It arose from the example of the Prophet and was at the heart of Islam. Quote, when the Prophet was dying and about to pass on to the next world, Gülen spoke to his audience in that hotel ballroom. He stated, I place in your trust the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews, end quote. And it is that notion of trust that hoşgörü inspires. When we see each other as God sees us, we can discover trust and cooperation that makes anything possible. What Hochguru produced then were countless public-private partnerships that advanced Hizmet around the globe. The story of Hizmet in Australia is a good example. Here's how Greg Barton, a good historian and friend, described it. Quote, inspired by Gülen's teachings about the importance of soundly educating and developing young people and the potential for youth-driven generational change through the development of a golden generation, Orhan Çiçek was convinced that he should focus his efforts on trying to help second-generation Turkish-Australian youth. He sought to mentor the young people who he encountered and engage them in practical programs involving sports, outings, some basic tutoring. He also began to lead Risale-i Nur reading groups amongst these teenagers, as well as amongst their parents, end quote. As I continue in the biography following Barton, before long, by 1987, Çiçek had opened a light tutoring center in inner city Melbourne, one of the first non-for-profit Muslim educational foundations in Australia. That group held its first Hizmet fundraising event in late 1991 and brought in 70,000 Australian dollars. That was enough to buy a building to serve as a dormitory and tutoring center. Similar events were launched in Sydney, and in 1996, Schuyler College opened there, with Ishak College in Melbourne following just a year later. By 2014, there were 4 Hizmet-related schools on 3 campuses in New South Wales and 8 schools on 6 campuses in Victoria. Overall, Hizmet workers in Australia had started 16 schools across the continent that continue. Now, what is crucial to understand about the schools is that they represent, like the think tanks and other Hizmet enterprises, private-public partnerships, or more specifically, a faith-inspired but structurally secular solution to a social problem. That is the definition of a faith-based social enterprise. It originates in empathy, but it is engaged in best business practices to reduce suffering and solve a social problem, in this case, illiteracy. The schools mobilized private resources to address public problems, as did the think tanks, tutoring centers, newspapers, magazines, television stations, and so on. That paradigm was and is the heart of the business model of Hizmet as a civil society movement down to today. And for all these activities in civil society, Gülen and people of Hizmet have come to be called terrorists by the Turkish government. In one of the most stunning examples of an Orwellian big lie in recent history. Gülenists, goes the Turkish party line, had infiltrated the police, military, and judiciary in what amounted to a deep state. Gülen himself was the puppet master of this deep state, orchestrating minions in a cult-like hierarchical political apparatus whose goal was nothing less than the takeover of the Turkish government from a modest retreat center in Pennsylvania. The charges are absurd on their face, but conspiracy thinking has unfortunately become a feature of many societies in the wake of social media bubbles, in the wake of anxiety over our climate crisis, and in the reduction of a free press and journalistic integrity. Now, of course, there were people inspired by Gülen and the Turkish police, military, and judiciary until they were jailed or fired by the Turkish state. But people inspired by Gülen had also infiltrated, if one must use that inherently pejorative term, infiltrated the baking industry, furniture making, kebab shops, tile and pottery trades, IT, education, media, music, tourism, and much more. The point is this: as a non-political, non-violent movement of volunteers built around hoşgörü, Hizmet sought to bridge people's private practice of Islam with constructive engagement in all the domains of civil society. And is this a crime? Okay, final section, part 3. Beyond socialism or capitalism, social enterprise in the Hizmet mode. What is always a crime to corrupt regimes, whether capitalist or socialist, is the existence of power beyond their control. Power here understood, as Hannah Arendt speaks of it, as the capacity of people to act in concert. Both capitalism and socialism operate mechanically. They are systems imposed upon the natural world. In contrast, the organizational model in the life of Fethullah Gülen and among people of Hizmet is surprisingly organic. It's about the people. This is another one of those characteristic misunderstandings of the movement. There is a structure. In some areas it's clearer than other, more hierarchical than others, but it is hardly a machine. People come and go, start and die. Ideas are tried and found wanting, or they are tried and refined. This organizational model of social enterprise is grounded, not surprisingly, in another Islamic principle, istishara, or sometimes shura, Arabic terms that are usually translated as seeking advice or mutual consultation. Here's what Fethullah Gülen says about it. For the Muslims of today, consultation, he here uses the term shura, is a vital attribute and an essential rule, just as it was for the first Muslims. According to the Quran, it is the clearest sign of a believing community and the most important characteristic of a congregation who have given their hearts to Islam. The importance of consultation is mentioned in the Quran to the same degree as salat, prescribed prayers. Given this importance, the most intelligent person is the one who most appreciates and respects mutual consultation and deliberation, and who benefits most from the ideas of others, end quote. Now, this sounds nice, but is it practical? In fact, if there is one lesson to be drawn from the life of Fethullah Gülen and the Hizmet movement, it is that mutual consultation is the most reliable path to the success of any venture. Gülen puts it in the negative, quote, ventures and enterprises embarked on without sufficient prior consultation do not go far. What this means positively, again to quote Gülen, is that to consultation belongs the most important mission and duty of resolving affairs concerning the individual and the community, the people and the state, science and knowledge, and economics and sociology, end quote. In short, istishara is the secret to Hizmet's success. And istishara is the democratic bridge across capitalist and social paralysis in the growing of social enterprises, whatever the prevailing economic system of a society. The examples are as ample as the human imagination and as urgent as any societal need, of which the climate crisis is surely the most pressing. And yet what I find inspiring and a source of extraordinary hope is that despite repeated persecution, despite unprecedented pressure from the Turkish government, despite obstacles that would drive many individuals and movements into despair, Fethullah Gülen and the people of Hizmet carry on with Musbet Harakat, positive action, refusing to bow to external pressure and carrying on in the good work of Istishara, whatever the results. So I will leave you this evening with the final pages of the biography in words that point us not only to a business model, but to a profound faith that just might help save the world. So if you have the English edition here before you, okay, brief commercial, right, there it is, right? It's on, I'm on page 357. Finding hope in the midst of trouble had been a regular, almost routine part of his biography. And by now there were islands of peace, as he called them, on every continent. Those peace islands were the schools, dialogue centers, and social enterprises, wherever they operated. And those peace islands were countries where new friends could be made and where Muslims could practice their faith without oppression. For if an old man might be tempted during a cold winter in exile to despair of ever again seeing those green spring days, as he had written while in America, Gülen also wrote, eyes on a very long horizon and tied to no specific nation. Quote, our world will experience an amazing springtime before its demise. This springtime will see the gap between rich and poor narrow. Our world's riches will be distributed more justly according to work, capital, and needs. There will be no discrimination based on race, color, language, or worldview. And basic human rights and freedoms will be protected. Individuals will come to the fore, and learning how to realize their potential will ascend on the way to becoming the most elevated human on the wings of love, knowledge, and belief. In this new springtime, when scientific and technological progress has been taken into consideration, people will understand that the current level of science and technology resembles the stage of life when an infant is learning how to crawl. Humanity will organize trips into space as if they were merely traveling to another country. Travelers on the way to God, those devotees of love who have no time for hostility, will carry the inspirations within their spirits to other worlds. Yes, this springtime will rise on the foundations of love, compassion, mercy, dialogue, acceptance of others, mutual respect, justice, and rights. It will be a time in which humanity will discover its real essence. Goodness and kindness, righteousness and virtue will form the basic essence of the world. No matter what happens, the world will come to this path sooner or later. Nobody can prevent this. We pray and beg that the infinitely compassionate one will not let our hopes and expectations come to nothing. End quote. Last two paragraphs. In a winter of brutal strongmen, such hopes for a glorious spring seemed utopian, no better than a prayer. Yet if there was one thing that Fethullah Gülen really knew how to do, it was to pray. So when he encouraged people that difficulties increase in accordance with the greatness of the consequent reward, that too was a prayer. But it was also a maxim that had been tested in Fethullah Gülen's life and proven true almost from its beginning. To some, the oppression in Turkey signaled the death of Gülen's dream for a golden generation. And there was surely a death looming. The boy from Korjuk was now a frail old man. And yet Fethullah Gülen's life was never about a short-term horizon, to be measured by a brief span of 80 years and 10. He believed in heaven, he believed in resurrection, he believed in justice. These beliefs were not tied only to the next news cycle, the next election cycle, or even to an individual life cycle. His horizon was eternal. And if the moral arc of the universe was long, and it seemed particularly long in the second decade of the 21st century, Gülen and people close to him also shared the belief of many people of faith that the moral arc of the universe did bend toward justice. They were also convinced that it was humanity's duty to help bend the moral arc of the universe in that direction. As Gülen put it often in many publications, quote, "Power resides in truth," end quote. Any power otherwise founded was destined to fail. And so the end of Fethullah Gülen's earthly life, whenever it would happen, would hardly be the end of Hizmet. Eternal truth could not be contained by an authoritarian's ambitions. Fethullah Gülen had lived for a peace that surpassed understanding, because it was a peace that surpassed the superficial limits of time and space. After all, even a Sufi in exile whirled in a light far more substantial than mere earthly matter, caught up in an energy that was present at the very beginning of creation, and that would be there at the end of time. Thank you so much for your patience, and I understand that Dr. Leman may have some questions for me. And I look forward to your questions as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Pahl, and also the whole audience. When it says me that some 867 people are following on different platforms. Okay, we have some 35 minutes, I think, for questions. So I will ask you to try to answer, because I think there will be a lot of questions, to answer very in a concise way, and I will myself be very short. First, something about the book, because I think that many people didn't read the book. So to give an idea a bit after the conference, it's a chronological sequence in the book about the life of Mr. Gülen. It starts with Erzurum and Edirne, 1938-66. Then second part, Izmir, 66-71. Then the Aegean was called like that, 71-80. Istanbul, 80-99. And then the US, Pennsylvania, 99 till today, which may be, and there's a very important period, which would be called Hizmet going global. Meaning that maybe in the former periods, it was a bit less global. And it started maybe quite local also a bit in Izmir. That's a bit the chronology. Now, I have to be short, and I have 3 questions like that, coming from the book, but that didn't receive really an answer for me in the conference. So, and these 3 questions sometimes are also questions of some people I received before this conference. The first one is the culture of what I call the culture of consensus in Hizmet, and also as it is presented in the mind of Mr. Gülen. Now, I speak from I am absolutely not, I don't want to compare with Mr. Gülen, let's make very clear. But I was a bit also in politics and so, and also in management affairs. Now, there it is called quite clever, quite intelligent, to look around himself, not to have only people who agree, and to organize oneself in such a way that there are also opponents in the close environment. Now, in the book, I never saw something as Mr. Gülen as opposed or in discussion really with close followers. One thing. And I see also when I am in contact with Hizmet people that most of the time they insist very much on consensus. Now, there is a Greek proverb that's saying polemos pater panton, meaning sometimes you need discord. You need that inside your own culture. Now, my question to you is, in contacting close followers and Mr. himself, did you never see something as discord, as he really didn't agree, and was a debate? So that's my first question.
No, that's a great observation, Professor Leman. You know, istishara is the DNA, this idea of building mutual consultation. But within that, are there differences of opinion? Absolutely. You know, even about the schools, you know, as they were getting started, I think I narrate in there some of the differences of opinion that you see. But you're right. By and large, Hizmet has kept those debates and discussions internal. I think this is likely to change under globalization, as there are more rules related to transparency for agencies that develop. And I think that will be ultimately a very good thing in the mutual interaction between the model of istishara and then the model of sort of democratic openness. You have to recall, Hizmet has consistently in Turkey been suppressed. And for the sake of perpetuation of the agency and the institution, there had a degree of careful in public engagement. So I think part of that is due to the unique circumstances of the Republic of Turkey and the Kemalist regime. And I think under globalization, we're likely to see far more airing out of the discord and the conflicts in a way that will ultimately be a healthy thing, both for Hizmet and then for the societies where these agencies take root. Hope that's helpful.
Okay, thank you. But do you agree that it can be positive for Hizmet if there should be a bit more openness about internal debate?
Yes, we're in agreement on that.
Okay. Second question I have, one thing is when reading the book, one thing is the life of and the events and the person Gülen. It's very, I can really say that to potential readers, it's very interesting to see that and to follow that. But another thing is the movement. Somewhere you say it, you write it, and other people see it also. Sometimes some people say, you know, the movement, it developed too fast, too large in a short time. Is this possible? Is it possible? In a very short time, it became from something quite local to something really very, very extended worldwide. Now, can you say that your book, if you should write a book about Hizmet, I am right when I say the book is more about Gülen than about Hizmet. What should you add if you write a book about Hizmet that is not present in your book now?
I tried in the book to draw out the implications from Gülen's life for the kind of movement that developed, which was over decades, back to the 60s. Now, quick, and there is internal debate within a civil society agency, a collection of agencies, a group of corporations. Are we a community? And actually, I think the most honest label is Jamaat, is community. That there's this culture that has developed. And I think I would want to say more about that, a culture of trust, right? That is at the core of the relationships that develops between abis and ablas, and that network of people who share a vision, who argue over a vision, and then who get together and praise. And so, the book highlights 5 aspects of Hizmet, and each one of those aspects in a book would have to be further developed and much more deeply fleshed out in the extended relationships, in a particular region or a particular thread. So the 5 are, in addition to the chronology, there's also a topic in each chapter. And so the first chapter is learning and the emphasis on the schools. And a book about Hizmet would have to say a whole lot more about that, and would have to track the different schools all over the globe. I mean, it could be a huge book just on that alone. Second, on the nonviolent practices of Islam at the heart of the movement. This is one I find particularly interesting. What I've been working on for the last 20 years or so is religious peace building, how religions can contribute to peace. I mean, I've also studied the flip side of the story, how religions contribute to violence, but there's not been nearly enough attention to how the practices of prayer, fasting, pilgrimage contribute to building peace. And I think there's extraordinary potential for people in Hizmet to engage or to show practically in how the dialogue activities and the nonviolent practices at the heart of Islam contribute to peace building. Third chapter is engaged empathy, Hoj Effendi's tears, how empathy, deep feeling for the suffering of the world gets put into practice, and there would be a whole need to be much more work done on the different agencies that developed, including the media operations. I mean, all of those deserve books on their own to discover how this has grown so quickly and been so dynamic. The 4th chapter is about Hoshguru, which I mentioned earlier, and the 5th one is Istishara. So each of those principles in a book on the Hizmet movement or community would have to be, the emphasis would have to be flipped. So Gülen would be there, but it would be much more about the people on the ground in the different locales, living it out. Does that make sense?
Okay, then a last question from my side, but then I prefer that others put their questions also. Last question, I was quite lucky I could visit Hizmet in Turkey. I could visit Hizmet in Europe in some countries, and also in the US. It was very interesting. Now, I was impressed by Hizmet everywhere, but I was surprised a bit by Hizmet in the US. And then I learned something there, that Hizmetians there said to me, listen, our children, we have a problem a bit. Turkey is far away. Some language in Hizmet is Turkish. They don't understand. So that's one thing. Second thing, they are quite strong. They have really very strong institutions there. They have university, they have community houses, impressive schools. They have their own development to the third world and so. And when I came back from the US to to Belgium and I spoke with some of my Hizmet friends, I said, listen, I have the impression that the future of Hizmet is more in the US than in Turkey. It's more in the West than, I don't say that Turkey is not the West, but Turkey is more the meeting place between East and West. And then you have Western Europe, that's okay, that's what it is, an imbroglio a bit. But then you have the US. So, and you see also in the life of Hizmet that he is going from the local to the global. And you know, in many religious movements, not only in Islam, look also to Christianity, it's sometimes the situation at the end of the life of the leader that is quite determinant for the future of the movement. What is your impression for, and there's also a question of someone who says, what is the future of Hizmet? I know you can't, it's difficult to say it will be like that, but what is your impression?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's partly why I read the last couple of pages of the book, which speak to that matter. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm a historian. I'm much better looking back than I am looking forward. But the pattern within Hizmet has been as follows. Every time there has been an effort to repress, the movement has grown stronger. And that's certainly the case within Turkish history. And the question is whether that will also now extend globally. I think one of the keys will be the development of indigenous leadership. That is the movement of from a Turkish core or a Turkish essence to distinct versions in France and Spain and the United States and Canada and Australia. And certainly in Australia, that's been the case. That the movement is now, I know this is a loaded word, integrated into the cultures while maintaining distinctiveness at the same time. And I saw this quite clearly in Africa, where Hizmet has planted schools and think tanks in a variety of places. And when I would meet with the boards of directors of the different agencies, it would be 3 or 4 Turks and then 15 to 20 bankers and business leaders and engineers and local folks, which was really astonishing to see. And Gülen has bought a burial plot in Pennsylvania. And yet, the community continues, well beyond him. And, his influence, I think, over the years has, as the movement has grown, has become more indirect and truly as inspiration. I mean, we're not talking about a corporation with a CEO or a nation with its leader. It seems to me he's tried pretty carefully to really develop the spirit of Istishara and shared leadership, mutual consultation out there. But ultimately, my answer has to be, I don't know, but I know what I hope for, and I know what I've seen in the past, and therefore I have some confidence that this pattern will repeat itself. I mean, there's nothing has ever happened like the repression that we've seen after the failed or staged coup event, whatever it was that went down. It'll take historians decades to figure that out. So there is a very real challenge here, but a meeting like this one points precisely to the kind of hope and resilience and commitment to Mushbet Harakat, just consistent positive action, not reacting to the political winds, but just continuing very patiently and carefully to carry on. This is the very first principle of nonviolent organizing, right?
Okay.
Do not react to evil. That is, do not react violently to violence. And it's again a core principle in Gülen's life and in the movement itself. Thank you, Dr. Leman, very much for your questions. I look forward to those from the rest of us gathered here today.
Okay. Now I start putting the 10 questions I received already from here, the participants. First question, I give them in an order. First question. How would you interpret those who set their hearts on Hizmet not to leave the movement? And what you effendi, even though they lost everything and face severe oppression?
I'm looking for the questions. Is that the very first one, or?
The first one coming from participants here.
Okay. Could you repeat it for me? I'm looking at the Q&A.
He said, what do you suggest to people who set their heart on Hizmet? What do you say to them not to leave these people who lost it all now with what happened in Turkey?
I can't presume to give people advice who have had their life savings taken, their vocations taken from them. I will respect whatever choices people make, but it seems to me, again, the resilience of people and the willingness to cooperate and work together and support one another is remarkable. Advocates for Silence Turkey is doing some good work in speaking out and getting the word out, and we have to continue to do that, to advocate for justice and to work in whatever forums we can, right, to support people who are suffering, who are refugees, in fact. And there are no platitudes that I can say other than my own experience of Hizmet has been of a circle of friends, right, who truly care for each other. And I would think that circle of friends, that community, would be an incredible source of support and strength in the current tribulation.
And okay, another question. What do you see as the most important risks for Hizmet today?
What do I see as the most important risks for Hizmet today? Politicization would be the most important risk, as I see it. I mean, there's always a temptation or a danger to engage in ways that aren't productive or constructive in the political system. I think as long as Hizmet threads that needle between being public and holding private faith, and threads that civil society needle, that's really the path forward. And the dangers would be politicization on the one hand, or retreating into sort of a private enclave on the other. And so robust engagement with the public, but not politicized, is the trick as I see it moving forward.
Okay. Other question, what do you see as the most important weakness of Hizmet?
I have often spoken about gender relations within Hizmet, and the fact that Turkey was and is a deeply patriarchal culture. And I think as Hizmet goes global and encounters cultures where gender equality is at least a stated ideal and more or less a practice, that will be one of the great opportunities for Hizmet to demonstrate the truth of Islam and how Islam is about much more than what it often gets constructed as in the West. We have to remember that, you know, Western cultures, by and large, after the Cold War, were given through very creative and effective propaganda a new enemy in Muslims. And unfortunately, there have been events that have reinforced that perception. And so Hizmet really has an opportunity to demonstrate Islam and all of its complexity, and to demonstrate an Islam that really is about hoshkoru and about the equality of men and women, while also respecting the difference between men and women. Engaging in you know, discussions about LGBTQ matters is also on the horizon, and something that I don't think can be avoided for long.
Do you, sorry that I continue on that, do you have the impression that it is not enough developed now inside Hizmet?
I'm looking for that question again so I can read it once more, but I'm not seeing it. Can you repeat it for me when we're looking at different lists here? I think. But go ahead. Can you read it once more for me, Dr. Leman, please? I apologize. I'm sorry. I seem to have lost your thread. Could you repeat your question for me once more, please, Dr. Leman? I apologize. No. Okay. The look. I'm seeing this question. What do you think? For all knowledge about Hizmet movement, can you describe what is the future of Hizmet? Do you have any suggestions to make better future for all humanity? Thank you very much for your answers. This is from Tuba Yilmaz. Do you see that list, Dr. Leman? Anyway, I'll answer that. And I think one thing that Hizmet really could focus on that would be wonderful for humanity and for the Hizmet movement as well, would be to engage with the climate crisis. That is, to partner with other agencies addressing this crisis that we face that affects us all, and that cannot be avoided. And I think Hizmet is well placed, given the emphasis on the natural sciences and the link between faith and natural science, to really make a good contribution in that direction. Okay. I'm just going to move down the list here, Dr. Leman, that I have, so I can read them and know what I'm responding to exactly. What do you think about the men-women equality in Hizmet? This is an anonymous attendee. I spoke to that. I think Hizmet reflects to a degree the patriarchal heritage of Turkey, and yet has also challenged it and transformed it in remarkable ways. That hasn't always been evident in the public, sort of outward-facing dimensions of Hizmet. And I think that's likely to change dramatically as Hizmet takes root in indigenous Western cultures in the US and Canada, Australia, and elsewhere. There are some remarkable women leaders who are emerging. I got asked this question in Dar es Salaam, you know, who's the next Hoja Effendi? And it said, well, you know, could very well be that the next Hoja Effendi is a Tanzanian woman. So that's my answer to that question about gender equality. Dr. Pahl, what do you see most likely 3 risks for Hizmet movement heroes will face in the future? What do you recommend? This is from Bill G. What do you recommend for mitigation and prevention plan for those risks? Wow, the 3 biggest risks for the Hizmet movement. Well, one will be internal fracturing after Hoja Effendi leaves. I would not be surprised if there are some splinters that happens to movements in history, and so be anticipating that and prepare for it. Second would be to be right, further targeted by the Turkish government in the sort of outreach efforts. And the way to mitigate that is to maintain, insofar as possible, contacts within Turkey with people who understand the absurdity of the charge of terrorism. And I realize many of you, remain closely in contact with people there, and many of you have also lost contact with people, and that's just a real tragedy and trauma. Third risk, would be to, similar to the first, would be to sort of lose a center and lose the kind of coordination and cooperation that has identified Hizmet for today. I mean, if you look at the history of new religious movements, and in many ways Hizmet is a new religious movement or a revival movement within Islam, they don't always last for millennia. And I see Hizmet as a leaven within Islam, and then a way to foster, the kind of cooperation across religious traditions that's really imperative for our future. And so I'm hopeful in that regard that risk can be overcome. Mehmet would like to answer. Okay, I saw you wanted to answer that question live, or ask that question live. Go ahead, Mehmet.
I think it was already an asked question, so I just put answered. So maybe Eva can read the questions if you hear them from Q&A.
Would that be, John, would that be helpful? Yes, please. All right. So this is a question by Ali Begande 61. Despite of the principles, dynamics, or DNA of Hizmet, as you call it, the perception about Hizmet has always been on the contrary for the vast majority of society, especially in Turkey. I respect the power of media that the government holds, but still, how do you interpret this contradiction? How can a social movement which has a lot of talented volunteers be this weak in explaining itself to the citizens of society from which it originates?
No, that's a really great and powerful question. And my answer has to take us into the history of religious peace building and what happens to religious peace builders in societies. Gandhi was not exactly loved by the British Raj, right? Lima Bowie, the Nobel Peace Prize winner who organized the women of Liberia to end the civil war, was not exactly loved by either the warlords or the dictator Charles Taylor. So peace builders are often misunderstood. Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States in the 1960s, there were surveys, maybe 12, 15% of the US liked him. 75, 85% did not. Right? So peace builders are often misunderstood, and even more, peace builders are mischaracterized by people who want to hold on to power as force. Power as, access to material resources. And right now, unfortunately, the Putin model of crony capitalism is the prevailing system of economic life. We have these strongmen out there who have been dominating economic life, creating increased inequalities and generating scapegoats. That is, generating people to blame for the problems that are woven into the very fabric of the system. And it seems to me that's what we see in Turkey, that people receive what they hear from the media, which is now entirely controlled by the government. And it builds on the stereotypes that they may have had by seeing the rapid growth of Hizmet within Turkey, being jealous of it, perhaps, you know, not, or being resentful, because, you know, Hizmet, right, has incredibly talented people, and it was built to be, or not built, it grew, I think organic metaphor is better, it grew to be a place for a golden generation, for elites, for people who are really committed to education, to literacy, to engagement, and so forth. And so I think that helped make the movement, unfortunately, liable to be scapegoated by ruthless politicians in Turkey. But it's a really great question, but it needs to be set in comparative context to other peace builders and the way that they have been vilified repeatedly in history.
Thank you very much. I hope this has satisfied Adi Begandes' expectation. On to the next. This is a question by Yasmin. I personally find this question also very, very interesting. I'm very curious for this inspiring. I would like to know if you have any other religious movements to compare, historical or contemporary, to the Hizmet movement in terms of the change of paradigms in the three intersectionalities you mentioned: capitalism, communism, science, religion, etc.
Well, my primary field of study as a historian is religions in the United States. I mean, I studied at the University of Chicago Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but it's in particular in Christianity that I have done most of my work. And the movement that seems to me parallel in many ways to Hizmet within the history of Christianity would be the Society of Friends, or the Quakers, who were both very much pro-education. I mean, they founded some of the greatest colleges in the United States, Swarthmore, Haverford, and others, and a really fine private school system as well, from pre-K up. But they also raised principled capitalism, and did well. And they practiced a model of organization by consensus, and that continues down to today. If you go to a Quaker meeting, there's no one leader. There's the community gathered together, and it seems to me that pattern is common, or is at least a good analogy with Hizmet in some ways. And they've been very much active in peace building. They are dedicated pacifists, and the American Friends Service Committee out of Philadelphia is a remarkable agency doing work of peace building and advocacy around the globe. So that's one parallel. There are lots of others that are out there, but that's the one that makes the most sense.
Thank you very much. The next question was asked by EA. He or she asks, considering the fact that all the dynamics and DNA of the Hizmet movement is based on a religion, so it finds its basis for the moral action in a divine prescription, what about atheists and believers of polytheist religions? On what basis can they appreciate Hizmet movement?
That's a wonderful question, and a very important question as well. I think this is probably a growing edge for the movement, the community around the globe. Mr. Gülen was quite clear, as I quoted in his speech at the Renaissance Polo Hotel in 1995. Anybody can talk to anybody. We'll talk to anybody. We'll work with anybody on shared horizons and perspectives. The beauty, actually, of Gülen's understanding of God and doing things for God's pleasure is that it doesn't lead to judgmental othering, but in fact, it leads to a willingness to find common ground and work together on common goals. So, atheism was pretty significant within Turkey. And, some of the people Gülen was working with were avowed atheists, or from, not so much from other polytheistic traditions, but as Hizmet again grows around the globe, there are going to be encounters and relationships built, and the relationships, the trust is more important than the ideological or theological labels or tags. So I was delighted in Accra, Ghana, to be one of the speakers at the first gathering held to bring together Christians, Muslims, and practitioners of indigenous African religions, which of course are polytheist, if you want to use that label. But that's the kind of thing Hizmet can do, is bring together people across those differences. And I think that's a very exciting future for us. And there are lots of other groups doing that. And, Hizmet could and should collaborate with, Religions for Peace, with the American Friends Service Committee, with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and others. I mean, it's the single most important story in the history of religions in the 20th and early 21st century that nobody knows, namely the emergence of religious peace building and all of these agencies dedicated to religious peace building across lines. And not only with religious folk, but working also with people who have no stated identification as a person of religion or faith.
I would like to just have a side question to that. As a self-declared agnostic, but then what happens to the two wings you need to fly?
It's a great question. I'm an advocate of the school that everybody has something like a religion or a spirituality. The Lutheran theologian Paul called about people's ultimate concern. So however that gets articulated in whatever forms, that's the second wing. You could call it culture too. I mean, I think art, music, all of that, right? Whatever inspires, whatever sets a horizon for justice, for peace building, for cooperation and trust, that's that second wing. So yeah, I call it religion, but it's much broader than the institution.
Okay, so the morality comes from a broader.
Yeah, one of the things that is you discover as you study diverse religions is that no one of our descriptions of God is ever complete, right? We're all seeing part of the picture. And I think the more we can be humble about our claims for our traditions, the more we'll find ground on which to cooperate.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
The next question, I'm not sure if we still have a few minutes.
I can probably go for another 10 minutes if that's all right.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you very much.
Sure.
The next question was asked by Alper C. What do you think is the reason behind Hizmet's abandonment or even betrayal by the very society that it has been serving in Turkey so quickly?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I used the word scapegoating. I think Hizmet has been a scapegoat within Turkey to help Erdogan unite very disparate groups who hate Hizmet for different reasons. And, the theory of scapegoating, or the reason I use that language is that I've been studying for a long time the works of René Girard, Violence of the Sacred, and, the scapegoat, things hidden since the foundation of the world. I mean, he's one of the French immortals, really a remarkable man. And his theory of scapegoating says that societies under pressure will find ways to identify a group that's connected but not right at the heart, to unify the rivalry of all against all into a unity of all against one. And it seems to me that's what's happened in Turkey with Hizmet, is that you have the unification of the political Islamists on the one hand and the Kemalists on the other, who won't get along about much, but who will get along in scapegoating Hizmet and seizing the assets for the government, and shutting down this voice that seemed to create more rivalry, which actually was healthy for Turkey, of course, but unfortunately has been silenced in that scapegoating effort. I hope that's a helpful response.
I hope so too, Alper. So Omar says, first of all, thank you for this very inspiring conference. I want to ask you about the first time you met Mr. Fethullah Gülen. What was your first impression, your feelings when you first met him? So it's quite more of a personal question.
Yeah, no, happy to answer that. I waited until I had a complete manuscript of the book done before I met with him. I wanted to take into account criticisms and draw from as wide a range of sources as possible. The book would have been much easier had I sat down and talked with him earlier, I think, but when I didn't want to waste his time also, and when I did meet with him then, I was able to ask him very specific, focused questions about things that were in the book as well. I was a little worried going to meet him. I mean, I've spent roughly 10 years of my life doing research on this man. What if I don't like him? What if he doesn't like me? But in fact, we really had a beautiful meeting. This was in February of 2018. I believe, no, February 2019, I think. And we had two 90-minute meetings, and nothing that he said really changed or contradicted anything that I had written. In other words, the impression I had of him from what I had read and what I had learned from other people matched very much the person I encountered. And the language I used to describe him is gentle. In other words, he was a gentle man. And with a nice touch of humor as well. I appreciated that about him, but deep empathy, a gentle man, obviously very, very thoughtful and learned, but nothing I encountered contradicted what I had learned from my reading and interviews.
Thank you. The next question is written in Turkish, so I would really, really appreciate if either some of my Turkish colleagues, whether that is from IDP or across Europe, or our English to Turkish interpreter would be able to translate the question. It's the question written down by Hai.
Oh boy. Okay. Is the translator there?
I'm sorry to intervene. Translator is here, but I am not sure if he or she received the questions. But if we skip the Turkish question, may I start from the beginning so that most of the participants are wondering if they will have the Turkish version of the book?
I have nothing to do with the production of the book, unfortunately. I would hope someday there will be a Turkish version of it. I don't receive royalties for the book. Part of my arrangement was to donate the royalties to support Hizmet in Blue Dome. So I would pray that there will be a Turkish version someday. I worry a little bit about the Turkish version when it comes out, what the response will be of the Turkish government, but I'm completely willing to take that risk, and I hope the book does come out in Turkish. I trust that there will be a translation, but it's really out beyond my hands. I know there are translations in Arabic and Greek and Korean, Romanian, and there are others coming, I trust, which is a very good thing. I'm glad for that.
Well, thank you. And it's really good scale of the language. So I hope we will have also a Turkish version as well. So I don't know we have any time to ask other questions because you already said that you have only 10 minutes.
Okay. Türkiye binlerce insan zulüm görmeye devam ediyor. Right? Okay, that's the question. Apologize for my terrible translation or my terrible pronunciation. Democracy taraftarı başta.
It says that oppression is continuing in Turkey, and what you can advise for Hizmet movement people, Hizmet participants, to not having this kind of oppression in Europe or United States.
Oh, it's a wonderful and great question, and I think the simple answer is, again, make friends. That is, develop networks locally with people who will take you under their wing and who have a shared vision. So whether that's with other Muslim groups or with Christian organizations or with other civil society agencies who are working for similar goals. Certainly media, having contacts in the media helps, as would contacts, friends in the government and similar places like that, police departments and so forth. So, develop networks of friends in whatever region you are in. So in other words, infiltrate the cultures that you're in. Make friends is a nicer way to put it, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your patience and taking the time to answer all the questions plus extra. I would love to give the floor back to Johan Leman.
Well, I will be very short. Thank you, Professor Pahl. You stay a time in Europe, or you remain in Europe for some time?
I wish I could come to Europe and stay with you. I would look forward to that very, very much. The day the pandemic hit, I was slated to go to Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. And my ancestral lands are in Norway. My mother's side. On my father's side, they're in Germany. So I would hope to coincide a trip to advocate for Hizmet and to develop my book and speak on behalf of the movement, with a couple side trips to visit my ancestral lands for the first time. That would be a great joy for me.
Anyway, thank you a lot. I think I can thank you in the name of all the participants. It was an interesting, very instructive evening. I hope also for the participants, that they continue to feel trust in the movement. And, we are all mortal, also the people who for the moment maybe are a bit oppressive. One day they will be away. Be sure of that.
That's correct. And thank you. Thank you, Dr. Leman. And I see that there are responses in the chat. Some people had more questions. I put my email in there. This is a risky thing to do. I received lots and lots of emails, but I will try to respond if you have a really urgent question that you would like to ask. My email's there, and you can send it to me. Thank you very much for your time. It's so good to see you all. Peace and
okay. Thank you. And good evening.
İyi geceler.
Bye.
Görüşürüz.
And thank you to the organization.
Yep. Bye bye.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leman and Mr. Jon Pahl.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Mehmet. Bye bye.